Welcome to Beyond Markets. Many thanks for joining us. I'm Esther Awuni. Coming up on today's show, we'll discuss ways of improving synergies between Africa and Germany. Remember, you can be part of the conversation. Just join us on Twitter at CNBC Africa. You can also send tweets to my Twitter handle too, at Esther O. Awuni. Use the hashtag Beyond Markets. Now, German President Frank-Walter Steinemeier is preparing for his second trip to Africa in less than a year. Now, later this month, the president will also visit South Africa and Botswana with an economic delegation of about a dozen German companies. Wilke, Associate Director for Southern Africa at Africa Practice, joins me from Johannesburg as we explore ways Germany is seeking to increase ties with Africa. Thank you, Mari, for taking the time out to join us today. It's a second visit by the German president. Now, earlier this year, German Chancellor Angela Merkel was also here in Africa. What is your interpretation of these events?
Morning, Esther. It's a pleasure to be here. The visit of the president is really just one more activity of a number of high-level interactions that we have seen between heads of state and government of African nations and Germany over the past 24 months. It started in 2017 when Germany took over the presidency for the G20 and was working towards the G20 summit and made Africa really the core of what Germany was trying to achieve with its presidency at that time. The visit of Chancellor Angela Merkel earlier this year was definitely a culmination of that, and for us as observers it was very important to see how she was now walking the talk of what had been agreed during the G20. The president in Germany is not an active policymaker or an active politician. He is the formal head of state. So his visit falls into a slightly different category. But what should be emphasized here is that also his delegation will include a fairly strong industry delegation that is going to come to South Africa and Botswana with them. And it again emphasizes that Germany is really trying to encourage its industry to have a closer look at Africa and to increase the ties between the two nations and continents.
Now, this is obviously an offshoot of the Compact with Africa initiative, which was put together to help make Africa more attractive to private investors. But what we're hearing is that, and I know that there's a focus on German SMEs, not the big companies in Germany. But what we're hearing is that these SMEs say that they will need government guarantees from the German government to avoid financial trouble. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Esther. Yes, and I think it's important to emphasize that we are not only seeing visits from high-level politicians from Germany in Africa, but we also saw an invitation from the Chancellor just last month of heads of state of government of African nations joining her in a stock-taking exercise of the Compact with Africa 1 year later. And 12 heads of state followed the invitation and attended the Africa Investment Conference in Berlin in October. And a number of these measures were discussed and obviously interrogated during that event. The SME focus from Germany in particular, not just the Compact with Africa, but Germany in particular, is a reflection of the German economy. 99% of industry in Germany is in the category of SME or Mittelstand, which is the German categorization of it. There are some larger companies within that category as well that would fall into the middle-sized companies, and it is particularly those companies that Germany is trying to attract to Africa and encourage to move into Africa. The issue of risk management is definitely very important to those companies, and there are a number of measures that are being discussed. Earlier in 2017, Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, Minister Müller, already mentioned in his strategy paper that was specifically looking at recalibrating the relationship between industry and development recipients in Africa. He had already mentioned that government was going to work towards tax reductions, tax rebates for companies that are investing in Africa, and also to make it easier to offset losses that are related to particularly risky investments in Africa. That being said, I think it's also important to emphasize that many measures already exist. There is a large portfolio of assistance available to companies, and what often happens is that companies that should be making use of them are simply not aware of it. So there is a very important component of education and awareness building among SMEs in Germany and other European countries as well, to enable them to make use of the tools that are already available and to ensure that they not only understand the potential of African nations and investment and trade into Africa, but also understand the measures that are already available.
Okay, let's circle back to the German president's visit, his second this year, and of course that would suggest that Germany does mean business this time. What should we expect from this trip in terms of the African countries that will be on Germany's radar, the countries that they're seeking to strengthen economic ties with?
As I mentioned earlier, the president's visit falls into a slightly different category, as he's the former head of state of Germany and not an active policymaker. So we can expect that his focus will really lie on the bilateral relationships between countries, and that is in this particular instance South Africa and Botswana. From looking at the delegation, we see it's not only a business delegation per se, but there's also a large cultural delegation traveling with him, actors, musicians, directors. So we can see that there's also a strong focus on the type of industry that is particularly encouraging and thriving in South Africa and that is interested in increasing ties with German partners. At the same time, the visit follows directly after President Ramaphosa visited Germany just a few weeks ago and had an opportunity to highlight how the bilateral commission between South Africa and Germany should be looking like going forward. What is particularly interesting is that this is the first visit of an active head of state of Germany to South Africa after 20 years. South Africa and Germany have had a long tradition of particularly good relationships. Nelson Mandela in 1996, I believe, started the initiative, and for a number of years we saw very good engagement, but we haven't had a formal bilateral visit of an active head of state to South Africa 20 years on. So I would expect to see the president's visit putting a particular emphasis on how the relationship should be looking like in the future, and putting culture and putting South Africa's agenda at the center, not so much Germany's agenda, but the South African agenda and the commonalities between the two countries, really.
Okay, let's focus on trade now between Germany and Africa. Now, for some reason, Germany has lagged other countries when it comes to trading with Africa. The available data that I've seen shows that Germany, that with an annual trade of 60 billion, that's all that Germany has had. And at the moment also, when it comes to trade between those countries that Germany does business with, South Africa, Nigeria and Algeria, the trade balance is still in favor of the German government. Is this going to be a conversation that will take center stage when talks, active talks begin, either with the president or with the German authorities with African leaders?
Yes and no. So first of all, I should say on the statistics, what you referred to, first of all, that's statistics relating to trade in goods. It excludes trade in services, which is particularly relevant to Nigeria and South Africa, the two main economies that Germany trades with at the moment. 2/3 of Germany's trade is in relation to these two nations. Also, it puts an emphasis on exports as a consequence of that, since it is looking particularly at trade in goods, which definitely is currently in favor of Germany as opposed to African nations. At the same time, recent statistics indicate that in 2017 we saw an 11% increase of trade between Germany and African nations, which is very substantial and the largest increase that we have seen for German statistics in the recent years. So that is very encouraging. The relationship, particularly between Germany and South Africa, should also be seen through the lens of investment. And there we see many South African companies actually engaging in outward investment into Germany. Cecil and Sappi, for instance, have manufacturing capabilities in Germany and have increased these over the years. So I think there will be a focus less so on the trade deficit, but more on how can we increase these opportunities? How can we increase outward trade and outward investment from the African nations, in particular South Africa? This will most certainly also be seen in the context of the European Economic Partnership Agreement that was signed last year between the SACU nations and Mozambique. It's called the SADC EPA. It's a particular free trade agreement between the EU, of which Germany is a member, as well as the most southern African nations, including South Africa. And the agreement is now there. It's on paper. There is a new thrust into trade liberalization, which is very much in favor of South Africa. But the question is, how can you now incentivize and enable and capacitate South African companies to make use from these opportunities? I think in Botswana, on the other hand, which is the second country that the president will be visiting, I would expect to see more an emphasis on Botswana's wish to also join the compact with Africa. Botswana is not currently a member, but I understand it's particularly interested in joining. And this is against the background of Botswana currently engaging in an exercise of promoting its economy and being more prioritized in terms of the sectors it is trying to promote abroad and attract investment in.
Now, Marie, do you see other African countries signing up to the compact with Africa?
I definitely see their increasing interest, in particular after the investment conference that took place a few weeks ago. I must admit that until then I was in the camp of those that were a bit skeptic about the compact with Africa. It felt as if it was repeating a lot of conventional wisdom, and we know that these type of initiatives are only as good as the commitment of the nations behind it. The investment conference, in my view, has shown that both the African nations as well as the G20 partner nations from the Western world, in particular Europe, are keen on actually seeing this initiative through. I also understand that Argentina, who has taken over the presidency of the G20 and will be hosting the summit later this month, is particularly keen to put another emphasis on Africa and to further that compact with Africa. There have already been discussions between the Sherpa, the negotiator of Argentina, and the African Union, for instance, and there's a very active process going on in terms of soliciting more African countries to join. What I should say is that the compact with Africa is designed in such a way that it puts the emphasis on the African nations and their agendas. So the compact with Africa looks very different for each and every African nation because it is based on their national agenda, their national priorities. And at the end of the day, it is implemented through bilateral agreements, bilateral collaboration that exists directly between the particular African nation in question and partner countries. Germany currently has a particular emphasis on Tunisia, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, increasingly also South Africa, though the other countries are by no means discounted, so there is a flourishing relationship as well there. And we see more and more German companies also signing agreements and MOUs with countries that are partaking in Compact with Africa, facilitated through the Compact with Africa. So the conference that I mentioned, the October Investment Conference in Berlin, for instance, saw the signing of an MOU between Siemens and Al-Sisi, the president of Egypt. And we've also seen a number of other larger companies moving into African countries. Volkswagen announced the establishment of a new company in Rwanda, for instance. We see Daimler announcing an investment of 600 million into South Africa. And we see insurance Allianz giant buying into an insurance company in Nigeria. And these examples are definitely encouraging more and more African countries to join the compact with Africa, putting on the table what they would like to prioritize for their country and what they would like to bring in, but also get out of the compact with Africa.
Marie, I must thank you for your time so far. We'll take a short break and we'll come back and pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to you, Marie Wilke, Associate Director for Southern Africa at Africa Practice. Still with me on today's show is Marie Wilke, Associate Director for Southern Africa at Africa Practice. Now, Marie, back to the compact with Africa deal. Now, this all stemmed, of course, as you know, from the illegal migration that we've seen from Africa, especially to a place like Germany. And what we also hear is that the issue of migration, I know that there are economic talks going on between German authorities and some African countries, but the issue of migration will definitely always come up. And what we're also hearing is that Africa has a different idea about what the solution is compared to what a country like Germany thinks. Share your thoughts with us in terms of how African governments and the German authorities can, on the one hand, talk about trade and also find a solution for the migration crisis.
Thank you, Esther. I think that trade is actually very much at the heart of the solution, and this is also the message that we've been hearing from Chancellor Merkel. So we see that the Compact with Africa, as well as a number of other initiatives, have emerged out of what has been coined the refugee crisis in Europe. Not particularly a big fan of the term, but what we see is that trade is seen as a vehicle of incentivizing and making it possible really for especially a young population of Africa that currently feels a need to migrate to Europe to see opportunities in their home countries. It's not a short-term solution, it is a long-term solution, but in my opinion it is very much this emphasis that is needed, the long-term solution, creating jobs and creating opportunities across Africa, and that is also what has motivated the Compact with Africa.
Now, it would appear that the German authorities are only willing to do business with those African countries that are reform-minded, which is part of what is stipulated in the Compact with Africa. Would you say that, I mean, just looking across the African continent, that there are a good number of African countries or governments that are currently reform-minded, that the German, even perhaps any other European country, can actually do good trade with?
Absolutely, is that. One point that should be made here is that when the Compact with Africa speaks about reform-minded, it is reforms with regards to the macroeconomic environment, with regards to the business environment and the financial environment that are referred to. So it's not a broader reform agenda, but it's really with regards to these three elements. And we do see many African nations that have particular national reform agendas in place and that have made very good progress towards implementing these reform agendas. I mentioned earlier that the Compact with Africa puts an emphasis on the national plans of African nations as a baseline and a basis for the Compact with Africa, and that's where this reform thought comes in. It is very difficult to base a compact, a bilateral relationship on something that is not looking forward and that is not looking at addressing challenges that are being raised by business that is eager to move into certain markets. That being said, I think we shouldn't be discounting the point that many African nations also still require support with regards to accelerating their reform agendas. And when we look at the comments that have come out of the investment conference in October from industry, we see that they put a particular emphasis on regional reform agenda, the need to assist African nations in their regional trade and investment liberalization agendas to ensure that markets are not only seen as singular markets in terms of one country at a time, but that regional markets are formed and that investment can come into regional markets as opposed to national markets. And I think this is a reform where African nations can't be left alone, and I would hope that we see a greater coherence and alignment between the development agenda, which often emphasizes this regional economic community support, and the Compact with Africa and other investment and industry initiatives.
Now, this is all coming at a time when Africa is making significant moves on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I'm just wondering, will this impact on trade discussions that Africa, maybe as a whole or as individual countries, having with potential new partners from Europe and other parts of the globe?
Absolutely. So the Continental Free Trade Agreement is seen as a great opportunity for investors as well as companies looking to trade with Africa. It is, as I mentioned, it is important for companies to be able to use market access to one country as a means of penetrating other neighboring countries and regions as well. The Continental Free Trade Agreement is at a very early stage, even though it has been signed and we've seen a lot of publicity around it. The devil is in the detail here, so to speak. There will still be a lot of effort and work required to ensure that the so-called schedules that really liberalize at the end of the day trade in goods and services are finalized, and that will require substantial negotiation between the participating African nations. What we have seen as great successes so far, however, are the agreement, for instance, that is liberalizing the air travel industry across Africa. There was a side agreement signed together with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, not as much publicized, but I think this is an immense opportunity. And also discussion around facilitating cross-border movement of people, so not just of goods and services, but of people, which is really the single most important reform that we need to see on this continent.
Would you say that African countries are in a good position right now? Because it's not just Germany that's seeking stronger trade ties with Africa. We have the US, we have the UK on its own. I mean, Brexit is not done and dusted yet, but we know that, of course, when that is done, the UK is also seeking to get better trade deals with Africa. Do you think that Africa is in a good place in terms of getting the very best of trade deals at a time like this?
I do think that Africa is in a good position in terms of increasing attention, which is what we've been craving to see for decades now. We see France accelerating its involvement. We see the UK accelerating its involvement. Prime Minister May just recently visited Africa. Again, first time that an active Prime Minister has been in Africa for a very long time. We see Japan and India forming a new partnership. Turkey is increasing in its involvement, etc. So it's a very long list of desirable partners, really, that are increasing their involvement in Africa. I don't see this yet translating into trade agreements. Trade agreements are a very particular animal, and when we look at the global formation of trade agreements at the moment, the emphasis continues to rest on Latin America and Asia. I'm not convinced that it is necessarily trade agreements that we need at this stage, though. I think it is very concrete investment agreements, and not investment agreements just between state to state, but investment agreements between individual companies and countries. And we need to see an increased involvement of industry in regional discussions as well as Pan-African and continental discussions. And I think the increased attention from heads of state across Europe and other nations is definitely the first step towards that. It's about increasing the profile of Africa and increasing its attractiveness, and I think we've made huge steps in the last 24 months.
Now, Marie, some analysts have expressed concerns about the pace of the investment talks, or rather the fruit that will come from these investment talks. Is that something that you would consider to be a source of concern?
Oh, definitely. I think no pace is really fast enough in this situation. And as I mentioned, we've been waiting for what we see right now for decades now. But I'd like to see it more as the glass being half full than the glass being half empty. I really think that the last 12 months we've seen in a picking up of the pace, which is very encouraging. And now it's about maintaining that momentum and building on it. I think a lot of it is homemade. We need to see the pace of the Continental Free Trade Agreement accelerated. We need to see the negotiations of various intra-continental agreements being concluded at a faster pace, being implemented at a faster pace. We need to see governments on the continent also putting greater emphasis on ensuring that their companies understand the opportunities that exist under existing free trade agreements, such as the new economic partnership agreements that have been concluded with Africa in the last few years. I've seen very little publication around that, very little promotion around that, and we definitely need to see a picking up of the pace there. But that being said, the last few months in particular have been quite encouraging towards that end.
Thank you, Marie, for talking to us today. We really do appreciate your time. That was Marie Wilke, Associate Director for Southern Africa at Africa Practice. Well, that's our show for today. Remember, you can watch all previous episodes of Beyond Market on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Market, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awuni. For myself and the team, do have a good evening.